Today we're going to take a look at the command line address book challenge presented at Topcoder. Only have a couple of things to go over on this particular challenge. The last challenge had me build out the menu controller, and all this did was present the access menu to the user, and we can see that if we actually run the menu. And as you can see, it has 5 options: view all entries, create an entry, search for an entry, import entries from a CSV, and exit. It also keeps track of how many entries are in the address book. And so that's what we were supposed to build out for the last portion of the exercise. This portion of the exercise, we were supposed to build out the option 1 and 2, the view all entries, and the create an entry, and this is a create a manual entry. So the first thing we'll do is we will actually go ahead and create that manual entry just to show you that it works. So if I want to create an entry, I choose option 2. Now it says that we've chosen option 2 and to enter a valid name, and it sets a template: first name, last name. So we go ahead and enter the first name. So let's enter Tim, and the last name, let's enter Spartan. And so once we press the carriage return here, what will happen is it should, according to our options, it should ask for a valid phone number. It also gives a template, and that's 3 digits, a dash, 3 digits, a dash, and 4 digits. And we will go ahead and do that real fast. So let's just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. So a 10-digit phone number, and it accepts that. And then it says enter a valid email address. And so we'll just enter tim@spartan.com, and it takes the valid email address. Notice that the main menu has increased its entry count by 1. Now what I've done is I've also built validity checks into this create an entry. So if I want to create a new entry and I try to just press enter, it continues to ask me for a valid name. Now, I have not yet done a name resolution where it specifically asks for a first name and a last name. I will build that into my next iteration of this command line. But what I wanted to do is make sure that it actually took a string there, and the check for this is that as long as this string is not empty, it will accept a name. Again, some people only have one name, some people have multiple names. You may not know the person's first or last name, but you can still enter their name in here. This template is simply for an ease of search, but we will get to that in a minute. So notice it won't let me add a name if there is no name present. So let's say I just want to add a name. Let's do Prince, just one name, and it will actually accept Prince. Now the valid phone number check, it basically is checking to make sure that there are 10 digits. As long as there are 10 digits, it should accept a phone number, but if I just do 1, 2, 3, 4, it's not valid. If I just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so 9 digits, not valid. If I, however, do 10 digits, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, it should accept it. Again, I didn't put a section, and this is more for a web-based API to have 3 and 3 and 4. This just makes sure that you have a 10-digit phone number. So again, when searching for a phone number, it saves you time. You don't have to press the parentheses key or the dash key to actually separate those numbers. You can just use 10 digits. Again, that template just shows you that you need 10 digits. Now the valid email address, I've actually used a built-in checker for this email. So I'm requiring the URI from the base code, and what it does is it actually will check to make sure that when you enter an email address, that it follows that mail to regex match. If it doesn't, so if it doesn't have an at symbol, or if it has too many periods in it, so I can't go something like period, 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 at period, period, period.com, it will not accept that. So there actually has to be a valid email there. So for example, if I do test@test.com or even co.uk, it should accept that email address. As you can see, it did. My entry count went up 1, and that was clear. Now, the build, again, doesn't have a build for the search or for imports. So if you just press 3 for search, you'll get awaiting build. And if you press 4, again, awaiting build. So those options are valid entries. They just don't have any backing behind it. And then, of course, if I want to exit the program, I would press 5 to exit. But before we do that, I want to test that number 1, that view all entries. So I'll press number 1. And what this is going to do is it's going to display one entry at a time, and then I have to press enter to actually move through the next entry in the address book. So pressing enter will give me Tim Spartan at the phone number 123-456-7890. And the email is tim@spartan.com. Okay, and then I see my next entry, prints 123-456-7890, test@test.co.uk. Okay, so a couple of things thinking ahead. I probably need to build a more clear validity check for the telephone numbers, simply because you may not want to press the dashes, or you may expect to press the dashes. I'd have to sort out how to do that, but I will certainly work through that. And then, of course, I have to build out the import entries from a CSV. Again, that shouldn't be a problem. That is just adding file structure to this menu controller. All right, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and exit out of this program. And as you can see, it says goodbye after you've chosen number 5. Let me clear the screen real fast, and let's talk about the RSpec, because this whole thing is to make sure that we are building for the test. So what I've done is I've created an RSpec, and I've required RSpec and the relative address book. I am describing the address book spec. The first thing I do is I create a subject, and that's going to be the book, and that's actually going to call that address book class and create a new address book. Then I'm going to go ahead and test the address book entry. Now, this is a very simple address book. So what it's going to do is it's going to create an empty entries array when it initializes, and then it's just awaiting for us to add an entry to this address book. In order to add an entry, it calls the entry class, which initializes with a name, a phone, and an email. And as it's being input, as we saw, it has to be a valid name, phone, and email, or it won't accept it. And then the entry class, again, has a display entry, and that's what we saw when we pressed 1 to view all entries, and it just clearly displays the name, the phone, and the email as such. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we're testing the size, and the whole reason for this size is to actually update that count as we input entries into the address book itself. So again, very simple class, and now let's go back to these tests. So in order to add an entry, I call that add entry from the class. So I call the add entry method, pass in a name as a string, a number as a string, and the email address as a string. And note, I did just make this phone number a string. Of course, I could make it a number itself, but I would have to change the user input to an integer, and this just saves that. Plus, it's fairly easy to build a regex file against a string, so I've done that. And then what's happening here is it expects the book size, so that the entry size will be 1 once that is added. And so that just tests that we can enter an entry manually. The next test run on this address book spec is that it should be able to access multiple entries. Now, we were able to see all the entries when we put them in using the view all entries menu item, but we want to actually test to see if those entries are going in there in the right location. Basically that we have an array and it's taking those entries specifically. So I've added 2 entries using that add entries method. So I've added Jake Potter and Tim Spartan with the appropriate information. Now again, this book size should now equal 2 because we have 2 entries in there. And the first entry is in fact Jake Potter. Again, it's first because it's going into the array first. So it's pretty easy to keep track of where these entries are going into the array. So my entries dot first dot name attribute is Jake Potter. The phone attribute is 12345678890, and the email is jp@potter.com. The next entry is the last entry in there. Again, I only have 2. I could add a third one just to test this out and show you that it actually works, but I just wanted to call the first and last just to show you that those 2 things work. The name for the last entry is Tim Spartan, phone is 555-555-5555, and the email is tim@spartan.com. So again, these entries are built out into the address book spec. Of course, when I add search and import from CSV, those items will also be spec'd out as well. But these are the 2 main things that we're testing for at this time. I didn't want to overbuild the spec just yet, but we will get there eventually. So let's go ahead and actually run this spec. What I'm doing is I'm just going to run the generic command for running the spec, so bundle exec rspec. And this is just going to run all the specs in the file system. And so I have 2 other specs as well. The entry spec just tests the entry to make sure that everything is inserted correctly. So it tests the entry for a name, a phone, and an email after it adds Julius Caesar at his phone number. And notice that the phone number can also have parentheses as well. It tests the name, it tests the phone, and it tests the email, which again will be tested here as well in the address book. Then the menu controller spec. Now again, with the menu controller, it is mocking an entry. So what that means is that it's just making sure that it can accept a selection. And so it's expecting the session, that's that menu controller, to receive a selection, which will be basically an integer at this point, with an instance of integer, and it responds to all of those integer values. And again, it's just testing to make sure that that menu controller will accept a response at some point. That is in fact an integer. If it's not an integer, it will kick it back and just run through the menu again until you've chosen an integer. Okay, so those are the other 2 spec files. Again, not the things that we're really testing right now, but to make sure that it works, I built out those spec files. And of course, we have to build out the entry spec file just to show you that the entry, in fact, does work. So I'm going to go ahead and run that generic rspec right now. And what is happening here, what we're seeing here is because the menu controller actually starts a session whenever we run the file, that's what's happening here. So I could in fact go through and create an entry at this point. I can view all entries if there's anything in there. We can see when we do the search for an entry. But what it's looking for is for this session to complete before it will actually run the rspec. So I recommend just leaving it here so you can actually not have to change the code, but should you want to, in the menu controller, I've created a comment at the bottom before I create the session that says uncomment the lines below if you want to run the menu, and comment them out if you want to run the test. Now you can just skip all of that simply by exiting out of the session. So if you press 5, it will actually run all of the RSpec. Again, it's this workaround that we have to deal with when we're creating manual entries into the program. So it's waiting for that session to complete before it actually runs the test. Now again, if we want to just run the test, we can simply comment out these the session itself and excuse me, and run the RSpec again. And as you can see, it will just immediately run the RSpec. All tests pass, and that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the forum, and I will answer them as soon as possible. Thank you, and have a good day.